Good afternoon to you all and welcome for the second day of the webinar Farm to Fork Strategy and the Impact on the Fruit Juice Industry. My name is Wouter Loks and I'm the Secretary General of the European Fruit Juices Association. We defend already since 1962 the interest of the European fruit juices industry, and this ranging from the processing of fruits till the bottling of the juices. I will be your host of today, and we organize this together with SGF International. SGF International has been established since 1974 as an organization set up by the industry to control the quality and the authenticity of the juices. For those that joined us yesterday, some of you might have had some problems with the internet. We do apologize for this inconvenience, which was due to some technical problems at the streaming. But we have recorded the session of yesterday as well as today, and we will make them both available on our website. Back again, there is a possibility to have some questions. For this, we use the application Slido. You can access Slido through your mobile or your tablet by scanning the QR code or following the link on your laptop. You can already pose the questions during the presentation, so you don't have to wait until the end of the presentations. I will now hand over the moderation of this session of today to Nenad Dragicevic of SGF International. Nenad, the floor is yours.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm Nenad Dragicevic from the SGF International, and I will be your moderator for the day. This is the second day of the two-day webinar titled The Sustainability of European Food Systems, the Impact of Farm-to-Fork Strategy on the Fruit Juice Industry. In the next decade, we will experience a lot of changes driven by the farm-to-fork strategy. I will mention only some of them: reduction of the use of pesticides, switch to a more sustainable use of the land with less irrigation, reduction of carbon emission from the agriculture, increase in organic farming, and reduction of the sales of microbioles. Given that the realization of the strategy requires a multidisciplinary approach, we have prepared this webinar for the juice industry to gain insights of the levels of changes included. Only by knowing can we stay compliant with the changes. Yesterday, we had exceptional presentations on digital farming, GMO, biological control products, and demand for organic agriculture. But for today, we also have a challenging agenda in front of us. In line of order, we have a presentation on common agricultural policy, followed by a lecture on Water Framework Directive. A short break is planned afterwards, after which we will continue with a presentation on integrated pest management, followed by Pollinators Initiative. After every presentation, a 5-minute Q&A session will follow. And of course, we will try to answer all of your questions in the time we have, but if we don't make it during the webinar, your questions will be forwarded to the presenters. Therefore, let me introduce the first of the speakers on today's agenda, Mr. Njörl Gerlitz. Mr. Gerlitz graduated in agricultural science in 1992. Following a number of advisory roles within the food industry, he joined the Commission in 1999, working primarily as an auditor for Directorate General Santé, covering the food and veterinary chain. He joined Directorate General Agriculture in 2018 and is currently working on farm-to-fork strategy and specifically reduction targets for pesticide risk in use. Common agricultural policy post-2020. I give the word to our speaker, Mr. Gerlitz.
For this introduction, Nenad, we will directly start with the presentation of Dr. Gerlitz. Please, Mr. Gerlitz, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Not quite doctor yet, but anyway, to maybe give you, entertain you for the next half hour or 20 minutes in terms of a presentation on the Common Agricultural Policy and how it is intended to support the implementation of the farm-to-fork strategies concerning, particularly in regard to pesticide reduction targets. As you're aware of, there are two targets, one in terms of the overall risk reduction, and a second one relating to the reduction of 50% in volume for the category 3 pesticides. Now, my colleague Andrew Owen Griffiths will speak at length about that and what the colleagues in DG Sante are doing with regard to the implementation of that. But I want to speak initially with regard to what the Common Agricultural Policy is doing to support the farm to fork strategy. As many of you, or maybe for those who are not familiar with the farm to fork strategy, or indeed with the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, as it's commonly known, plays a key role in supporting Europe's agricultural sector. I suppose in the past that has been, it's had a very different focus, but now we're more focusing on managing the transition to a more sustainable food production, and also to support the efforts of farmers to contribute to the objectives in the Green Deal. That is primarily what the CAP is intended to do in this regard. So I'm going to sort of outline some of the supports that the CAP is currently doing. So if I could have the next slide, please. So currently there are a number of areas where the CAP is supporting. We, of course, have organic farming and the transition from so-called conventional farming to organic, and that is certainly a major pillar, if you like, of the policy with regard to meeting the targets. But there are many other elements. We already have cross-compliance elements in terms of at farm level, where farmers are required to adhere to best practice in terms of using pesticides. We have, of course, to support the Farm Advisory Service in member states, which currently it's a voluntary requirement in terms of giving advice to farmers. In the future, in the new CAP proposal, this Farm Advisory Service, as I'll speak later, will be reinforced to really provide support for farmers in terms of meeting the requirements of integrated pest management. There is also several ongoing research projects. You may have already listened to some of them with regard to precision farming. Certainly, there are several million currently being invested in different projects, whether it be integrated weed management, integrated pest management. So it's an ongoing support. This DG Agri will continue into the future. Next slide, please. So if we just bring the slides forward to the whole, it's an animation. So if I could ask you to bring them to the complete and continue. Yes. So we have various different elements currently at farm level with regard to, first of all, in terms of payments to farmers, there is support in terms of direct payments, particularly with regard to rural development. There are many schemes ongoing where farmers have invested beyond the legal requirement currently, and so the CAP is providing funds where farmers and indeed cooperatives are going beyond the current legal requirements. There are also several operational programs under the horticultural sector, and I mentioned here the wine sector, the vine sector. Certainly, that's perhaps of interest, where there are several schemes which are receiving support on the CAP to go beyond. So this is Integrated Pest Management Plus. There are also, we also have tried to encourage farmers in terms of, well, not necessarily to encourage, but there are several statutory management requirements. Now, these cover a wide range of areas under farming practices, but with regard to, I guess, for fruit producers, yes, certainly at farm level, there is a requirement that farmers would follow best practice. And of course, we do have the Water Framework Directive and the requirements around that. And of course, the Farm Advisory Service. So these all combined are currently the elements which the CAP is using to support pesticide reduction at farm level. If I could have the next slide, please. So with regard to these, what we call statutory management requirements, these are requirements which are directly linked to payments at farm level, and they relate to, for example, the current food law within the EU, and this covers, of course, the requirements that that pesticides, that farmers follow the and record the use of pesticides. With regard to the regulation on pesticides itself, there's a general requirement that farmers would follow best practice. Now, as my colleague Andrew will point out later in his presentation, this is an area which is particularly difficult at member state level. For those of you who have read the overview reports on the implementation of EU legislation concerning the sustainable use, you will have seen that, of course, there are many issues with regard to the verification at farm level of the implementation of this regulation. This is an ongoing issue and something which we hope to address. Certainly the colleagues in Sante are working on it in terms of providing and encouraging member states to put in place criteria which would enable not only the verification by the competent authorities of the implementation of this regulation, but also would provide a baseline by which perhaps in the future such payments may be better tied to if you like, implementation. There is also this concept of good agricultural practice in terms of the the good agricultural practice and environmental condition. Again, this is contributing to, again, good practice in terms of pesticides with buffer strips along water courses and, of course, the protection of groundwater. So, next slide, please. In terms of greening, there are a number of elements that to CAP currently in terms of crop diversification, ecological focus areas, and protection of permanent pastures, all of which are intended to move towards a more sustainable type of farming. Next slide, please. Agro-environmental and climate measures, several of them mentioned here. Again, all contributing to a reduction in pesticide use at farm level in a sustainable way. Next slide, please. At sectoral operational level, particularly within the fruit and vegetable sector, there are several national environmental programs ongoing. Again, these are supported on the basis that they are going beyond what is the current legal requirements. They are, if you like, named in several member states in different ways. Some refer to them as IPM plus quality programs. But nonetheless, the main point here is that CAP is not intended to, if you like, necessarily provide resources for implementation of legislation, but more because member states themselves, are responsible, and indeed the operators are responsible for this. But it's more to support the overall implementation. Okay, next slide, please. So currently we also have the Farm Advisory Service. Again, its main focus, it is, well, in this regard, our discussion today is to provide advice on areas, well, integrated pest management, for example, in this case, particularly with regard to the different cropping systems, production systems. It's an area which we know, certainly could be developed more. Currently, it's voluntary. Under the new proposals for the future CAP, this would become a compulsory requirement for member states to develop this farm advisory system. And we would imagine that this would be a cornerstone for the future in terms of really enabling farmers to meet their legal obligations. Next slide, please. So for the future, well, I guess it's more to really, we've tried to bring in more of the integrated pest management within the payment system. So next slide, please. So in terms of the intention for the future is, well, as you know, for those who've been watching the Green Deal, there are new targets relating to organic farming. There is now a 25% target for 2030. In terms of the Farm Advisory Service that I mentioned, this will now be compulsory in member states. The payments to farmers, again, these have been reinforced to ensure that certain elements of integrated pest management, which we believe currently can be verified at farm level, will now be part of will be part when the future proposals are agreed. We believe that certainly it's important that certain elements of integrated pest management be included in the conditionality, if you like, or conditionality for payments, for future payments. Next slide, please. So I'm not, there are many elements here, but I've just picked out some of them in terms of the elements that we believe will be major contributor from CAP towards the farm to fork targets, and particularly the targets relating to pesticides. We believe that changes that we've made in the good agricultural and environmental practice at farm level, covering everything from grassland to peatland to the use of the farm sustainability tool, crop rotation. These are all going to be major, will contribute to the implementation of this directive. Next slide, please. I mentioned already that we would have enhanced conditionality in terms of conditionality for payments. And certainly we would hope that member states would contribute to this by introducing principles at national level, which would be fit for verification at farm level. Those are some of the points there in terms of, okay, these will be under the current proposals. We have crop rotation would be certainly an important element in terms of the integrated pest management. Next slide, please. There are also, it is also a proposal under the current CAP to extend the eco schemes and to devote more money to schemes which would have environmental and climatic change. They will be compulsory for member states, but again, voluntary for farmers. But nonetheless, we believe that these will be an important element, again, in meeting the targets. Next slide, please. And some of the, yeah, thank you. So again, the primary objective, bolster environmental care, climatic action, contribute to environment and climate-related objectives of the Union. Yes, these are clear objectives, but next slide, please. But within this, it's important to point out that these are baseline requirements, and that in order for CAP to contribute, we need to see proposals from member states which go beyond the if you like, this baseline. Next slide, please. And I think you can bring it forward. So we mentioned already eco schemes, and again, there are a number of possibilities within the eco schemes. The establishment of non-productive areas, diversification of crops, within the rotation, no ploughing, soil cover. These are all elements which we believe will be able to be eligible for eco schemes. And of course, the key one there at the bottom, maintenance of organic farming. Next slide, please. Under the management commitments and other payments, yes, we would reduce or ban of use of pesticides, use of integrated pest management, beyond the obligations under the Sustainable Use Directive, longer multi-annual rotation, and better diversification of crops, conversion to organic farming, payments for investment for pesticide management and localized spray, payments for training and advice. These are all elements which we believe would be eligible under the future CAP, and specifically under the so-called Pillar 2 management commitments and other payments, which again would all contribute to the overall objective of reduction in pesticide use. Next slide. So in addition to that, currently we do have several ongoing projects, research projects in this area, and these are specifically targeted at, again, I mentioned at the beginning, some integrated weed management, integrated pest management. Again, their overall focus is on the reduction of pesticides, whether this be on robots, or new tech. It is all part of the overall strategy in terms of research focus at the moment in this area. And of course, again, there are farmer organizations, environmental organizations, and networks which are supported by CAP, and which will continue to be a focus in terms of dissemination of information for the future. So that ends my brief presentation, I believe. If there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Garis, for this fantastic overview of the CAP and the reform of the CAP. And I'm sure it has provided some food for thought for a lot of questions. Nenad, I provide you now the possibility to moderate the question and answers.
Thank you, Wouter. We have some interesting questions here. The first I would choose, with the exit of UK from Europe, from European Union, there is a reduction in the budget as the UK will not contribute anymore. Therefore, how will the EC and the CAP project allocate these funds?
Well, there will be a reduction for sure, but I mean, in terms of, I'm not going to field the question. If it's possible to reply to the moderator in the future, that these, any replies that I could give, but I certainly couldn't reply to this now. I mean, Yes, it's unfortunate the UK are leaving, and it will leave a gap. But I know that my colleagues, that it's not going to affect this particular cap period, but going forward, clearly there will be adjustments. But it will be 27 and not 28. So.
Okay, thank you. Moving to a next question, could you shed some more light on the eco schemes that are part of the CAP post-2020 program with some examples of possible models?
Well, we talked about already under the eco schemes, we talked about the conservation of agricultural, for starters, the maintenance of organic farming, well, certainly that would be an important element within the eco schemes, given that the target for organic farming is 25%, and for many member states, there is quite a distance to go. So this will certainly be a major focus for eco schemes going forward, for the transition from conventional to this type of farming. But of course, there are also the other classic examples, the establishment of non-productive areas on agricultural land around watercourses. I mean, diversification of crops on rotation, including leguminous. I mean, these are schemes which are ongoing and which will be, certainly with regard to organic farming, will be expanded and will be the major focus going forward.
Okay, since we are short of time, we will just put one more question. How will CAP promote the increase of biodiversity?
Well, certainly in terms of the reduction in the use of pesticides, particularly for those pesticides which are in this category 3, the so-called candidates for substitution, and the overall reduction in pesticide risk, which these two targets will be fully supported by CAP in terms of its initiative. So, and many of the things we've just talked about. So certainly from a point of view of reduction in pesticides, that would be a major contributor, but so also will be the conversion of land to organic production, returning land to fallow. These will, and also the measures relating to hedge grows. These will all in themselves will hopefully have a significant contribution.
Just last question came in. It's a collaborative project looking at protecting and promoting wild pollinators, in which pesticide lists are revised accordingly, comply for any R&D funding.
There are a number of research projects currently ongoing which relate in this area. Specifically, measures which would have an impact on pollinators under eco schemes, I imagine would certainly be considered for funding, but under the schemes relating to eco schemes, but specifically research, there are several projects ongoing, and I think this is a subject for a future for the next panel, or for the next presenters.
Okay.
So maybe it's a question to come back with it. I think it's a question also to bring to some of the other presenters that are coming next.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers. Back to you, Wouter.
Thank you so much, Nenad. Let's continue to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Wally.
Next on the agenda, we have Dr. Caroline Whaley, who leads work on pollution and water industries at the European Environment Agency, with a focus on the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive and chemicals in the Water Framework Directive. Before coming to the EEA, she worked in a range of water and marine policy areas at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the so-called DEFRA in the UK. The Water Framework Directive. Ms. Whaley, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you. My name is Caroline Worley, and I'm going to talk to you about the Water Framework Directive and the Farm to Fork strategy and the sort of Green Deal and that aims towards sustainability. Just before we go into the detail of the talk, I'll introduce my organisation. I work for the European Environment Agency. We're an independent EU agency, Environment of the EU, and our role is to analyse, assess and provide information. So we're not a regulator. What we do is we look across the policy areas that are relevant and think about them and how they interact and work. And we also do quite a lot of data reporting for the EU. We provide an interface between science and policy, and we're really dependent on strong networks to carry out our work. So we have a network across our member and cooperating countries. That's 38 countries across Europe, not just the member states, but others as well. And we rely on experts in those to help us and to review our work. Okay, so the structure of my talk, we cover quite a lot of ground. So I want to just give you some steering through that. I'm going to highlight some relevant Green Deal initiatives. I'm going to focus on water, particularly around climate change and water availability, which are areas that really give us some concern in terms of the future, and then look at some recent work we've been doing on pesticides in water. So I'll put what's been happening in European environment policy. There's been a lot of work on here. I'm sure you've heard quite a lot already during the conference and before about the Green Deal that was launched last year. And that's got particularly relevant here is the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategies. They were published in May. We're expecting the chemical strategy to be published later this month, which will look about partly about the regulation of chemicals, but also around reducing the hazardous chemicals that are available in society. We've got the circular economy, which is about making thinking about things in the whole circle, not the linear processes where you end up with some waste at the end, but how do we make sure that waste is usable so that we become more sustainable? And then we've got the Zero Pollution Action Plan. That's due out in May next year or later next year, and it's basically sort of saying, going to give us some real markers and measures for how do we know if we're getting towards zero pollution. So that's due out. That's all under the Green Deal. But we already had quite a lot happening in relation to water and environment. We had the 8th Environmental Action Plan, which follows on from the 7th. That's due out later this year. You may be familiar with the water reuse regulation that was published in July, and that's really about setting standards across Europe for water that is to be reused in regulation. So some common standards, water to be used in irrigation, setting some common standards for that. Then the recast Drinking Water Directive, that should be available later this year. And the relevance there is that there's much more of a risk assessment and a risk prevention approach to that directive than there was in the past. That will bring in things like drinking water protection areas, so that the regulator or the water companies and water authorities can protect drinking water protection areas, so that to prevent pollution of those sources. Then I've mentioned here the review of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive and the Industrial Emissions Directive. They're underway. Particularly the urban wastewater. These directives, I mention them because they're very key in reducing point source pollution to the environment, particularly in relation to water, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. And that one particularly in relation to sort of phosphates from sewage, for example, that's really had a big impact, and I'll show you that later on. Also ongoing is that there was a review, an evaluation of the Water Framework Directive, and what's come out of that evaluation is that the list of priority substances should be reviewed. That was expected, and thinking around chemicals needs to be sort of delved into a bit more. And that list of priority substances, these are the ones that are regulated at European level across the EU. So it sets standards for concentrations of hazardous substances in surface waters. And then in the summer, the Commission launched the evaluation of the Sewage Sludge Directive. That directive was evaluated in 2014, but now there's another evaluation building on that. And just to remind you, that directive is about the quality of sludge that goes to agricultural land mainly. Okay, so it's going to focusing on things like micropollutants. Right, quick whizzing through the strategies now, just a quick look at them. I won't spend too much time on the detail because I'm sure you've had some more of this, but Farm to Fork is aiming at healthy people, healthy societies, and a healthy planet. The sustainability aim. Okay, and particularly relevant, I think, is to reduce dependency on pesticides and antimicrobials, to reduce the excess nutrients going to the land and then washing off into the soil, for example, washing off into water. There's plans for an increase in organic farming, and to reverse biodiversity loss. And the biodiversity crisis, you may have heard about this now, but there's a real concern in Europe and beyond about the loss of sensitive species and the loss of habitats that allow sensitive species and other species to exist, because that gives us resilience. If we narrow down to sort of very, very sort of particular and rather limited number of species, that's not only losing the quality of our environment, but it also makes us less sustainable. And it's also, the Farm to Fork also talks about the bio-based economy. So it's thinking about not creating waste, but how can we reuse things and to become more circular, for instance, like biogas generation. So just to pull into, just a quick summary of what might be relevant, I looked at the actions, and there's a whole list here, which I haven't got time to go through. But I've just picked out 3 in bold here. That's just a quick look at them. Reducing the use and risk of chemical pesticides by 50% by 2030. That's in both the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategies. So it's a significant commitment. I'll just show you the measure that might be on. So this is the pesticide risk indicator used by Sante, and this shows you it's based on the volume of pesticides sold in a country and the risk quotient depending on the type of pesticide. And the index is 0 to 120 on that scale going up, and there's dates from 2011 to 2018 from left to right. And we can see there's a bit of a drop, but now it's sort of stabilized at about 80 compared to what it was. And I would imagine that the 50% target, I mean, we don't know yet, but I would imagine you were talking about 50% from the more recent dates, so from that 80 figure. So that's a big change. Okay, that's a big change. Reducing nutrient losses by at least 50%, including reducing the loss of fertilizer by at least 20% by 2030. We already know that there's been efforts to reduce losses of fertilizer. I can show you something about that in a minute. But this is a big change. This is a big reduction, and it's to reduce pollution of, for example, to reduce pollution of waterways. We see blanket weed, we see clogging. That affects the biodiversity, affects the quality of the water. So that's another big target there. And then this bottom one, I wanted to explain it because it's quite complicated. It looks quite complicated, and it is. So guidance for measures to review water abstraction to restore ecological flows in river basin management plans 2023. Okay, river basin management plans are the plans set out under the Water Framework Directive. This guidance will be for countries to can set up measures to review water abstraction. So that would be that, and that's set for 2023. So we can see that probably is aimed that would then have come into effect with the water framework, with the river basin management plans that are planned in 2027. And the ecological flow is that some abstraction is so high, takes so much water out of the river or the stream that there's no flow there, or there's insufficient flow to maintain the natural biodiversity. So that the natural ecology. So that's what that guidance. Okay, it's going to come up. You can see it's some way off in the time, but that's the sort of thing that's being brought in by the biodiversity strategy. Okay, now we're moving to the water legislation, and I think it's useful to think about what are the underlying principles. So we have transboundary issues. The water legislation dates back to 1973, so it goes quite a long way back in the EU's history, in the European Community's history, and we can think about big rivers, crossing European countries, and if you've got one country upstream polluting the water, so the country downstream can't use that water, that's a clear imbalance within the community, and so if you can't drink the water, that's not very helpful. Okay, so the pollution issue has been really from quite an early stage has been a part of the water legislation, part of the EU's interest. More recently, we're thinking about water availability, although that has more national control over or interest in that. Another key principle around the water legislation is to provide a level playing field. If you've got one country that allows operators to pollute the water, and they don't have to have very good processes, they can pollute it, and all the costs basically are lost to the environment, that the operator's not paying for that. And you've got another country that's saying, no, you've got to really have good processes so we don't have to pollute the water. Then and that costs the operator because they're taking on board the cost of that pollution. Then you've got an uneven playing field. The polluting operator gets away with cheaper costs. So part of the water legislation is therefore to even up the standards so they've all got the same standards to pay for. Obviously, we want to aim for sustainability. We want to have a good environment in the long term, and that water is available not just for the environment but for ourselves as well into the long term. And underlying this also, since 1992, it's been written into the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, is a precautionary principle. If we suspect there might be a problem, we should prevent it. We should be careful of that and not do it rather than carry on until we find there's a problem. Because in environmental terms, you carry on until you find there's a problem, it can be very difficult to resolve. Once the pollutant is out in the water, it's out in the environment, we can't really get it back. Okay, it's very unusual to get it back. So let's be precautionary and think from that perspective, protect our waters. So the Water Framework Directive, it was agreed in 2000, and it's a common approach to managing European waters. So that's rivers, lakes, transitional or estuarine waters, coastal and groundwaters. So really a common framework. And it's done through river basin management plans, and those are typically done by the national authority or the regional authorities. And then if the river crosses international boundaries, then there's international river basin management plans. And the WFD, it considers what's affecting the quality, the status of that water body. So if the status isn't good, and there's all sorts of measures for that, then what measures should be taken? So from the 2016 reporting, so that's the second river basin management plans, we can see what sort of pressures on agriculture were, what was reported by countries as being pressures. And it was water abstraction for irrigation, for example. It was diffuse pollution, principally from nutrients and pesticides. And it's hydromorphology. Hydromorphology, and that's changing the natural flow of the water. So you're storing water, draining the land, you're reclaiming the land. And these all affect the natural flow, but also the organisms that can live in the water. And they impact on the ecology and the biodiversity. And in cases where pollutants go out to downstream, they go out to the rivers and down the rivers and into the marine environment. And the pressures aren't even uniformly distributed across Europe, but they're higher in Western and Southern Europe and lower in Eastern Europe. So you can see where you've got more intense agriculture, that's where it's higher. Looking at the nutrients, I referred to that before, we can see, so this chart just shows us the amount of nitrogen, kilograms of nitrogen per hectare of agricultural land. I think it's from 0 to 250, and then along the bottom here we've got the different countries in the EU. And the green lines are from 2000, 2003, and the blue lines are from 2012 to 2015. So they're sort of averaged in those times. And we can see that in quite a few countries, the amount of nitrogen applied has dropped a bit, and that's quite handy. That's good. We said there's a target to reduce nitrogen losses, because if you're not putting so much on, presumably you're going to lose less. Depends obviously on the practice. Because we'd expect some difference across Europe, but obviously there's a real range between Romania on the left and Cyprus on the right. What's it look like in the water? So on the left, we've got what was applied, and on the left, what can we see in the water? On the lower graph here, we see river phosphate. So this is nutrient trends in European water bodies, and it's between 1992 and 2017. If we see the green line, which is the longest timeline we have, we can see there's been quite a drop actually from about 0.11 down to 0.06. And this corresponds, remember I talked about the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, that and the reduced phosphates in detergent, that corresponds to that loss. However, in groundwater, which is the upper graph, we see nitrate concentrations in groundwater across Europe at the same time period, no change. Okay, nitrate mainly comes from agriculture, agricultural pollution, diffuse pollution. We know that groundwaters take time to respond to changes, but to see no change is sort of it's a bit depressing, because this is where we want to see the change, to reduce it to more natural levels. Okay. Now here's some climate change information. We haven't got much time to talk about it, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. That the blue bit, just to say, there's an awful lot more information on our websites here, and the links on these charts size work. So when you get the slides, you can look at the products. But the blue bits, there's more water. There's going to be more water. It may be seasonal and it may be intense, but there's more water. The yellow bits, there's less water and it's hotter. All right, just to summarise the graph. And so, you know, there's this is there predicting increased water shortages in southern Europe, particularly Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Turkey. And with climate change, we can expect changes in the pests and diseases. If you've got cooler regions that get warmer, then you're probably going to get more pests and diseases. Obviously, if it gets drier, some of those fungi and molds that rely on damp weather, maybe they won't be so common. Let's think about the use of freshwater resources. So this is like what's used for abstraction. It's from groundwater. This index shows the pressure on renewable freshwater resources at groundwater. And it's again, we've got the European countries on the left-hand side here, from Estonia down here to Cyprus, Greece, Spain, Turkey in the top. And this orangey line is the 20% exploitation. So that's saying they're under water stress. We're using that much water from the groundwater resources. And then this red line is 40%, and that is severe stress. Okay, so that's what we can see is happening now. And if we refer back to if you think this back to the chart we just looked at with the countries here that were already predicted to suffer more from climate change, and we can see already they're using a lot of the water. So this gives us concern. All right. Be aware of how agriculture plays into that. We have water use by economic sector, and in most sectors, so we've got mining, quarry in purple. We have the blue is sort of power generation, the pale blue is household, and then the green is agriculture, forestry and fishing. So we can see it's not a surprise that most of the highest use, the highest intensity is in the spring and summer. But this is when you've got a pressure on resources. The signs here are not good in terms of long-term sustainability for some countries. Just coming to some work we've been doing on pesticides. Here we show, again, based on the second RBMPs, basic management plans, the number of water bodies failing for pesticides out of 111,000 surface water bodies. There's 25 countries here. And basically the top one here is 700. Okay, so we've got groundwater, we've got nationally identified pesticides, and we've got European priority substances. So 700, maximum 700 out of 111,000 isn't very many. Looks like there's no problem. Is there or not? This is in contrast to the pressure that we know that there's a lot of scientific concern about pesticides. We could conclude that reporting is right. There isn't a problem. Could be true. We could conclude that the reporting is accurate for the substances we've got on this list, but we're missing information from many other substances. And or we could say, well, actually the monitoring misses the pesticides in the water because it's too irregular. It doesn't catch when it's being flushed through. We don't know, all right, whether these are right. We don't know. So that's a concern. It's setting off the alarm bells. Think about the precautionary principle. And then we also have issues of mixtures. And mixtures is really getting quite concerned at a European level in terms of chemical mixtures. So we can see our fish here, it's quite happy in its pond, doing its thing, or its river, it's there, it's got its food, the weeds there, all nice. And there's going to be a few things in there. Maybe a bit of copper, might be natural, might be just come in from some drainage somewhere. And there's a bit of diuron. It's a herbicide, but actually it's quite safe because, you know, we've got a European standard. It's a safe level. We've got another bit of herbicide, isoproteron. Also, we've got a standard. It's at a safe level. Might have a bit of cadmium. It's natural. We don't know. But actually, the thing about mixtures is that isoproteron and diuron work on the same pathway in the plant. And they affect photosynthesis. So they might take out the plant. So then we start impacting the ecosystem. And we don't really have a good understanding of control of that at the European level. So that's the concern about mixtures. So we're starting to see concern about mixtures and put that together pesticides, and we're starting to get worried now. Running out of time, so just to let you know, we published a report in the summer, the technical report about the data on pesticides at European rivers, lakes and groundwater, on data reported to the EEA by countries. And it's to sort of show you that we're working on the data. On the left-hand side, we have groundwater, and these substances are basically chosen by countries as the ones they're concerned about. So you have things like atrazine, simazine, diuron at the top. On the right-hand side, in surface waters, the substances we see there are basically the priority substances. So those are the ones that are monitored most frequently. In terms of exceedance, if you use the 0.1 microgram per litre standard, we can see about 1% of the reported stations or the reported monitoring showed an exceedance between 2013 and 2018, but some are much higher. All right, and there's all sorts of this is preliminary data, so this is just for get a feeling what's there. Right, I'm running out of time now, so I just want to say that there's real challenges coming. There's real challenges for agriculture, for all of us in terms of climate change, but we also need to think about pollution and how to make ourselves more sustainable. The Green Deal is a way of funneling that, directing that in a kind of coherent way. Okay, I won't teach you how to do farming, but please, there's plenty of advice out there, and your experts will give you that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whaley, for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Nenad, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Wouter. Once again, we have a lot of questions. First one, how does the EU intend to create a level playing field between member states and third countries?
So thanks for the questions. I think there's in relation to water, the EU actually works quite hard in neighbourhood, what they call the neighbourhood policy. So there's quite a lot of activity, for instance, with countries that are on the eastern border and on the southern border. And my colleagues work, for instance, in sort of North Africa, with North African network, as well as in the eastern countries, and it's called the Neighbourhood Initiatives. And so, because water is a transboundary issue, we've described that, and you'll be familiar how that works. And clearly, there's also sort of security issues at play here. I mean, the EEA has a membership of 38 countries, like I said before. Quite a lot of those will be from the eastern side. For instance, we have Balkan cooperating countries. And then in terms of the chemicals areas, well, you'll be familiar with the EFSA and the food standards, trying to make sure that the food's safe in terms of food, and trying to limit banned pesticides or pesticide residues in our food. So that's there's sort of chemicals area and there's water area. But there's sort of activities done which maybe aren't so public, but do go on in relation to this kind of activity.
Okay. The next one that we have is the following. The list of priority substances in Water Framework Directive has pesticides already banned in Europe. But how often will this list be updated with the continuous ban of pesticides?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the list of priority substances is set by a daughter directive of the Water Framework Directive. It's called the Environmental Quality Standards Directive. So that was set originally in 2008, which set the first 33 substances. And there was an update in 2013, which has added another 12 substances or groups of substances. And there should have been an update 6 years after that, it would have been 2019, but that got held back because there was a review of the Water Framework Directive. And until that evaluation, there was an evaluation of it, until the evaluation was done and we could see what was going to happen with the WFD, any update on the list of priority substances has been held off. That process has now started again. Now the WFD is not going to be opened up, so there's a review of the list of priority substances. That should be sort of a 6-yearly. But I think it's what's covered under the WFD in terms of priority substances is only a very small subset of all the pesticides that have ever been used, let alone that are still approved now. And really, you should see the ones that are in the priority substances are kind of the most harmful. They're really the most toxic or harmful in water. So not all the pesticides will be that harmful in water because they may be volatile or they do other things. That's not necessarily their toxic route. And the priority substance is toxic to or via the aquatic environment. So for some substances in there, not necessarily pesticides, but they're harmful to humans because we eat fish and the substances accumulate in the fish, for example. But the way to see the WFD, it's a safety net. We've got source control, which is trying to prevent harmful substances getting into the environment. And we can see the pesticides legislation is an example. Try and reduce the pesticides getting into the water. That's number one. Let's not get them in the water. Then if it is, how can we monitor it? How do we check it? And the WFD is that monitoring of a limited set that's required at European level. Member states do much more, but there's a limited set that are required to be reported at EU level. So there is an update, but it won't cover all the restricted pesticides. It's just going to be it's only ever going to be a subset of those.
We just got one additional question about this one. So is there already an approximate date when this list will be updated?
So the process for the review of the priority substances list is just kicking off. So what happens is that it's a collaborative between member states. Collaborative member states and the Commission. So they develop dossiers on substances which might be a priority substance, have the profile of it, as in they're toxic enough, they occur enough across Europe to need monitoring or to need reporting at EU level. And that's a sort of technical assessment. Then the Commission will draw up a proposal that will go to trilogue negotiation, and then that would then take some years to come into effect. So in terms of when it might appear, I mean, it's not before another 2 or 3 years, I would have thought, given where we are. So maybe 3 years, and then basically then countries will be then implementing that for the 2027 river basin management plans. So that's the sort of timescale we're looking at.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. And Wouter, back to you.
Thank you so much, Nenad. As announced, we have now a 10 minutes coffee break, so I'm looking forward to seeing you all back within 10 minutes.